Hello everyone. Before we begin today's story, I have a small favor to ask. Please hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our channel's new videos. It's quick, free, and the best way to support us in bringing you more dramatic stories. Your support means the world to us. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. Now let's dive into today's story. Stay tuned to see what Mark decides and how this unexpected proposal changes everything for him. The evening was cold, and the rain hadn't let up. Mark sat in his small apartment, the walls closing in on him as he stared at the phone in his hand. The call with Eleanor had left him shaken, her words lingering in his mind. Marry her. The thought seemed impossible, yet the weight of his situation made the offer look like a lifeline. His mother's medical bills were piling up, the bills from his father's debts were due, and his future seemed like an endless cycle of struggle. But could he really accept her proposal? Could he marry a stranger for money and security? He thought about the consequences. What would his friends say? His family? But what choice did he have? Mark ran his hand through his hair and let out a sigh. He couldn't stop thinking about Eleanor's calm demeanor. There was no hesitation in her voice. She was offering him a way out of the suffocating mess he'd found himself in, a chance to finally get ahead, even if it was through a business arrangement, not love. The clock ticked away in the silence of his apartment, each second pushing him closer to a decision. The next day, he arrived at Brooks Bistro once more. The rain had stopped, leaving the streets slick and shiny under the streetlights. As he stepped inside, the warmth of the bistro enveloped him, a stark contrast to the chill outside. He walked over to the corner table where Eleanor sat, waiting for him, her presence commanding yet calm. She looked up from her phone when he approached, her expression unreadable. Stay tuned to see how Mark and Eleanor's partnership unfolds and what surprises lie ahead for them. Mark sat in his small apartment, staring at the papers in front of him. The contract. His mind was racing, trying to process everything that had happened in the past 24 hours. He had said yes. He had agreed to marry Eleanor Brooks, a woman he barely knew, for the sake of his family, for the security that he so desperately needed. He still wasn't sure if he had made the right choice, but the weight of his decision pressed down on him. This wasn't just a marriage. It was a contract, an arrangement that could change everything for him. His debts would be paid off. His mother's medical bills would be taken care of. He would finally have a chance at a life beyond constant struggle. But at what cost? The next morning, Mark woke up to an unfamiliar sense of urgency. His phone buzzed on the nightstand, and he reached for it, blinking away the sleep. It was a message from Eleanor's assistant. Please be at the Brooks estate by 11 a.m. today for the signing of the final agreement. The message was simple, direct, and left no room for hesitation. Mark took a deep breath and got dressed. He knew he had to go, that this was the next step in what was now his new reality. By the time Mark arrived at the Brooks estate, the enormity of the situation hit him. The mansion loomed in front of him, its grand gates opening to reveal manicured lawns and towering pillars. It was nothing like the small apartment he had left behind. The contrast was stark, and he suddenly felt out of place, like an imposter walking through a world he didn't belong in. He took a deep breath and walked up to the door, where a butler greeted him and led him inside. Inside, Eleanor was waiting in a large, elegant sitting room, the kind of space you only saw in movies. She was seated at a long table, a pen and contract in front of her. Her demeanor was calm, composed, but Mark could see a flicker of something in her eyes. Maybe anticipation, maybe nerves. She looked up as he entered, giving him a small, almost reassuring smile. Mark nodded, walking over and taking a seat across from her. The silence between them felt heavy, the air thick with unspoken thoughts. He had agreed to this, but now that he was here, he wasn't sure if he was ready for what came next. Signing this contract meant crossing a line he couldn't uncross. It meant officially giving up any idea of love or personal choice. It was a business decision, nothing more. But there was a part of him that wondered if he could find some kind of connection with Eleanor, despite the arrangement. Eleanor broke the silence, her voice steady. I know this isn't easy, Mark. But once this is signed, we can move forward. I've already arranged everything. Your mother's medical bills, your debts, everything. This is the beginning of a new chapter for both of us. Mark stared at the contract in front of him, his hand hovering over the pen. He thought of his mother's smile, her constant worry about the mounting bills, the sacrifices she had made for him. This was for her, for the chance to finally give her some peace. It was for his future, a future that he had to build, one way or another. He picked up the pen, his fingers trembling slightly. He hesitated for a moment, the weight of the decision still pressing down on him. But then he signed his name, sealing the deal. It felt like a heavy weight lifting off his shoulders, but also a loss. A part of him knew he would never be the same after today. Eleanor watched him closely as he signed, her expression unreadable. Once he finished, she leaned forward slightly, her eyes flicking to the contract. "It's done," she said softly. "Thank you, Mark. This is the beginning of something different." Mark nodded, though the words didn't bring him any comfort. He didn't know what to expect now, or what the future held. But there was no turning back. His life had just changed in ways he couldn't yet understand. As they stood up, Eleanor's assistant entered the room, handing Mark a folder with the details of his new life, his new identity, his new responsibilities. The reality of it all hit him then, all at once. He wasn't just marrying Eleanor for security. He was becoming part of her world, part of her empire. And somewhere deep down, Mark realized that he wasn't just doing this for his mother, for his debts. He was doing this for himself. This was his chance to rebuild, to make a life that mattered. "Come with me," Eleanor said, leading him out of the sitting room and into a hallway that opened up to a grand staircase. "There's much to discuss and much to learn." As they walked through the estate, Mark felt both out of place and strangely connected to this world. He had signed a contract, but he wasn't sure if he had signed away his heart as well. Stay tuned to see how Mark's life changes as he begins his new life with Eleanor, and whether this business arrangement turns into something more. As Mark followed Eleanor through the halls of the estate, the weight of the decision he had just made pressed heavily on him. The grandeur of the house seemed almost surreal, its marble floors gleaming under the soft lighting, the walls adorned with artwork that must have cost more than he made in a year. It was a world he had never imagined entering, and yet, here he was, part of it, whether he was ready or not. Eleanor led him to a private office, its large windows offering a view of the sprawling gardens outside. She sat behind a massive desk, a chair opposite her, waiting for him to take a seat. Mark hesitated for a moment before sitting down, his hands still a little unsteady from the weight of his decision. The room felt cold, the silence between them thick with unspoken words. "This is where we'll discuss the details of our arrangement," Eleanor said, breaking the silence. Her voice was calm, professional, as if this was all just another business meeting. But Mark could feel the tension in the air, an unspoken understanding that something more than just a contract was now at stake. She pushed a folder across the desk toward him, the papers inside neatly organized. "I've already had your financial situation reviewed, and everything has been set up. Your debts have been cleared, your mother's bills are taken care of. The money you need to move forward is in place. But this is just the beginning. There are expectations, on both sides." Mark opened the folder, scanning the papers inside. It felt surreal. He had gone from barely scraping by to now being involved in a deal that was changing his entire life. He looked up at Eleanor, who was watching him with an unreadable expression. "What kind of expectations?" Mark asked, his voice a little hoarse. He still didn't fully understand the terms of this partnership. Was he expected to play a part? Was he expected to keep up appearances in public, to act as if they were truly a couple? The thought made him uneasy. Eleanor leaned back in her chair, folding her hands on the desk. "It's simple. We will attend events together, maintain the appearance of a couple, and carry ourselves as if we are a team. I'll take care of the financial side of things, and you'll do your part, whether that's attending meetings, charity events, or even helping me with decisions when needed. But there is no romance involved. This is strictly business. I don't want you to get confused about what this is." Mark listened intently, his mind racing. This was more than just signing a contract. It was a full-on commitment to a life that was as foreign to him as the luxury around him. There would be no love between them, no affection, just a partnership that was built on appearances and mutual benefit. He had to remind himself why he was doing this: his mother, the debts, the future. But something inside him stirred uneasily at the idea of living a life so distant from what he had imagined for himself. He swallowed hard and nodded slowly. "I understand," he said, his voice steady. But inside, a part of him wasn't so sure. Could he really live like this? Always pretending, always acting as if everything was fine when deep down, it felt so far from the truth? Eleanor studied him for a moment, as if weighing his response. I'm glad, she said after a pause. I know this isn't easy, Mark, but this arrangement will work if we both do our part, and I trust you'll do yours. There was a finality in her tone that made Mark feel as though this was the last chance to turn back. He couldn't. He had already committed, already signed his name on the dotted line. This was his new reality. Now, let's talk about your responsibilities in more detail, Eleanor continued, pulling a second set of documents from her drawer. There are several things I need you to be aware of. First, your public appearances. There will be events, galas, meetings where we'll need to appear together. I've arranged for you to attend a few upcoming charity functions as my partner. Mark felt a sense of unease settle in his stomach. He had no experience with the world she was talking about. Charity events? Galas? He was just a law student, trying to survive. The idea of stepping into that world, into her world, felt overwhelming. Eleanor seemed to sense his hesitation. You'll have the training you need, she said. I'll guide you through it. And, Mark, remember, this isn't just for show. This partnership means something, even if it isn't love. It's about trust. And trust is something we both need to build. Mark nodded again, trying to keep his emotions in check. He wasn't sure if this was the right decision, but there was no turning back now. His life was forever changed. He had stepped into Eleanor's world, and now he had to play his part. As Eleanor continued to explain the details, Mark's mind began to whirl with everything he had to learn, the life he had to lead. He had no choice but to accept it, to adapt to the new reality he had found himself in. And deep down, a small part of him wondered if, maybe, there was more to this than he realized. Stay tuned to see how Mark navigates his new life in Eleanor's world, and whether the lines between business and something more will begin to blur. The weeks that followed felt like a blur for Mark. He attended events, met with influential people, and sat by Eleanor's side at gala after gala. The world he had stepped into was far from the small, struggling life he had known. The luxury, the power, the polished smiles, everything seemed so foreign to him, yet he couldn't deny the sense of security that came with it. He had never imagined his life could change this quickly, but here he was, playing a role he never thought he'd be cast in. At first, Eleanor's guidance was invaluable. She showed him how to interact with the high-profile guests, how to move in social circles that were more about connections than anything real. They spent hours going over details of the events, the speeches, the small talk that would make all the difference. Mark felt like an outsider at first, but Eleanor's calm presence gave him the confidence to blend in. She made sure he was always at her side, presenting the perfect picture of a couple that was as solid as the empire she had built. But as the weeks passed, something began to change. It wasn't immediate, and at first, Mark didn't notice it. The events started to blur together, but there were moments, small, quiet moments, that made him question his role. He saw Eleanor in a new light, not just as a business partner, but as a woman who had worked tirelessly to get where she was. He began to admire her strength, her ability to stay composed in the face of everything she had built, and how she navigated a world that was often cruel and unforgiving. She was more than just a woman with power. She was someone who had fought for everything she had, and it made Mark feel a sense of respect that he hadn't expected to feel. One evening, after a particularly lavish charity auction, they found themselves alone in the back of the car on the way home. Mark sat beside Eleanor, his thoughts racing as he looked out the window. The night had gone off without a hitch, but there was something different now, something in the air between them. You did well tonight, Eleanor said, breaking the silence. Her voice was warm, and Mark could tell she meant it. You're getting the hang of this. Mark smiled faintly, feeling the weight of the compliment. I'm still trying to catch up, but I guess I'm getting used to it. He paused, glancing at her. Thanks for showing me how it's done. Eleanor didn't answer immediately. Instead, she stared out the window, her fingers lightly tapping on the armrest. Mark couldn't tell if she was lost in thought or just waiting for something. Then, she spoke, her tone softer than usual. I know this wasn't what you signed up for, Mark, but you're doing more than just fulfilling a contract. You're helping me in ways you don't even realize. Mark turned to look at her, his curiosity piqued. How do you mean? Eleanor shifted slightly in her seat, as if deciding how much to reveal. There's more to this than just appearances. It's not just about the events or the business. You've brought a kind of balance to my life that I didn't even know I needed. Having you by my side, it's been easier than I expected." Mark felt a strange knot tighten in his stomach at her words. He wasn't sure how to respond, but the vulnerability in her voice caught him off guard. Eleanor, the powerful and unshakable businesswoman, was admitting that his presence had made a difference. And in that moment, he felt something stir inside him, a connection that went beyond the contract. For the first time, he began to question his feelings. Was this just the comfort of companionship? Or was there something more developing between them? Something he hadn't expected to feel for someone he was supposed to marry for business purposes? He wasn't sure yet, but it made him uneasy. It was easy to see Eleanor as the strong, independent woman she projected, but there was more beneath the surface. And somehow, he had become a part of that. The car pulled up to the estate, breaking the silence between them. Eleanor looked at Mark for a long moment before speaking again. "We have a long way to go, Mark," she said quietly, her voice steady again. "But I'm glad you're here with me." Mark nodded, unsure of where this journey would lead, but feeling a strange sense of purpose. He had agreed to this arrangement for security, but somewhere along the way, he had started to care for the woman he was supposed to be helping, caring in a way that went beyond the contract, beyond the deal they had struck. And that was both comforting and terrifying at the same time. Stay tuned to see how Mark and Eleanor navigate the growing tension between their business partnership and the feelings they're starting to develop for each other. The days that followed felt like they were moving in a blur, but Mark couldn't ignore the growing connection he felt towards Eleanor. What had started as a simple business arrangement was slowly becoming something more complicated. It wasn't just about the events or the public appearances anymore. It was the quiet moments, the ones that didn't come with cameras or staged smiles, where he found himself drawn to her in ways he hadn't expected. One evening, after a particularly exhausting charity gala, Mark found himself in Eleanor's office, sorting through papers. She had asked him to help with some business matters, and he had agreed, knowing it was part of their arrangement. But tonight, it felt different. The usual distance between them seemed to have faded. Eleanor was sitting at her desk, focused on her work, but there was something in the air, something unspoken. Mark glanced at her, the soft glow of the desk lamp casting shadows on her face. "You've been working nonstop lately," he said, his voice quieter than usual. "Are you sure you don't need a break?" Eleanor looked up from the paperwork, her eyes locking with his. There was a moment of silence, a pause that felt heavier than it should have. Then she smiled, but it wasn't the usual practice smile she gave at events. It was softer, almost genuine. "I'm fine," she said, her voice steady. "I just have a lot on my plate. But thank you for asking." Her gaze lingered on him for a second longer than necessary, and Mark couldn't help but notice the faint lines of exhaustion around her eyes. She was always so composed, always in control, but there was something in that moment that made her seem more vulnerable than he had ever seen. Without thinking, Mark walked over to the desk and sat down across from her. "You've been carrying this empire on your shoulders for so long," he said, his voice low. "You don't have to do it alone, you know. I'm here. I agreed to this partnership for a reason. Not just for the money, but because I believe in what you're doing." Eleanor was quiet for a long moment, her fingers tapping lightly on the desk. Mark could see the subtle shift in her expression, as if his words had cracked open something deep inside her. She looked at him, her eyes softening just a little. "It's not about needing help," Eleanor said quietly, her tone reflective. "It's about trust. I've spent my whole life building everything I have, and I've never let anyone in. It's hard to let someone close, even now. But you've made it easier than I thought it would be." Mark's heart skipped a beat at her words. There it was, the vulnerability he had been sensing, the cracks in the perfect facade she had built over the years. She was starting to trust him, even in ways that went beyond their contract. He took a deep breath, not sure where this was headed but not wanting to pull away. "I'm glad I could help," he said, his voice steady. "I'm here for you, Eleanor. I'll always be here for you." The silence between them stretched for a moment, and for the first time in their partnership, Mark wasn't just the man who had signed a contract. He was something more, someone who had earned her trust, someone who was starting to see the woman behind the businesswoman. And it terrified him just as much as it comforted him. Eleanor looked at him, her gaze intense. "I'm glad you're here, Mark. But this partnership, this arrangement, it's never been about just the business. You're more than that. You've shown me that. Mark felt a knot in his stomach. He had known this would be complicated, but he didn't realize just how much. The lines between business and something else were starting to blur, and it wasn't something he was prepared for. But in that moment, he knew he couldn't just walk away. He couldn't go back to the way things were. As they sat in the quiet of the office, the weight of the situation pressed on them both. What had started as an agreement for mutual benefit had grown into something neither of them had expected. The question now wasn't just whether they could keep up the charade, but whether they could navigate the deeper feelings that were beginning to surface. Neither of them had the answers, but for the first time, they were willing to find out together. Stay tuned to see how Mark and Eleanor's complicated partnership unfolds, and whether they can move beyond the walls they've built around themselves. The days following their quiet conversation in Eleanor's office felt heavy, as if the air itself was charged with unspoken words. Mark couldn't help but notice the subtle changes in their dynamic. They were still playing the role of the perfect couple, attending galas and charity events, but there was a growing tension between them, an unspoken bond that neither of them could ignore. Mark had always been good at reading people, and now, he found himself reading Eleanor differently. She was no longer just the powerful businesswoman he had signed a contract with. He was starting to see the layers beneath her strength, the vulnerabilities she kept hidden from the world. And it made him wonder if he could continue to maintain his distance, or if, somewhere along the way, his feelings for her would change. One evening, after a particularly long and exhausting event, Mark found himself once again sitting in Eleanor's office. He had come to discuss the details of an upcoming project, but the conversation never really got there. The moment he stepped inside, he noticed Eleanor was sitting at her desk, her posture more rigid than usual. She was staring at something on her computer screen, but her mind seemed far away. He paused for a moment, watching her, wondering what was going through her mind. "Eleanor," Mark said softly, his voice breaking the silence. She looked up, her gaze distant, but when she saw him standing in the doorway, her expression softened, and she gestured for him to come in. "I'm sorry, Mark," she said, her voice quieter than usual. "I was just thinking. It's been a long week, and I'm overwhelmed, I suppose." Mark closed the door behind him and walked over to her, sitting across from her. He could see the exhaustion in her eyes, the same exhaustion he had seen in the early days of their arrangement. He couldn't help but feel a pang of concern. Despite everything she had built, despite her wealth and power, Eleanor was only human, and that human side of her was showing through. "You don't have to do this alone, you know," Mark said gently, his voice steady. "I'm here. I agreed to this arrangement, and I meant it. I'll help however I can." Eleanor gave him a small smile, but it didn't quite reach her eyes. "I know you're here, Mark, but it's not that simple. I've spent my whole life building everything I have, and now, when I finally let someone in, I don't know what that means. I don't know what it means to trust someone, to let them see the real me." Her words hit Mark harder than he expected. He had always seen Eleanor as the epitome of strength, the woman who had built her empire with her own hands. But now, he was seeing the cracks in that facade. She was scared of opening up, scared of being vulnerable. It was something Mark understood more than he cared to admit. "It's okay to let people in," Mark said quietly, his voice full of sincerity. "You don't have to carry everything on your own. I'm not just here for the business side of things, Eleanor. I'm here for you too, whatever that means." The words hung in the air between them, and for a moment, neither of them spoke. Eleanor's eyes softened. As she looked at him, her walls slowly beginning to crumble. Mark didn't know what this meant for them, what path they would walk together, but he knew that this moment had changed something between them. Eleanor was no longer just his business partner. She was someone he cared about, someone he was willing to stand by. Eleanor finally broke the silence, her voice barely a whisper. "I don't know what's happening between us, Mark. I don't know what this is, but I appreciate you being here." Mark nodded, his heart racing. "I'm not going anywhere, Eleanor. You don't have to figure this out alone." As they sat there, the weight of the silence between them felt different than before. It wasn't awkward or uncomfortable. It was the kind of silence that came with understanding. Mark wasn't sure where this would lead, but for the first time, he wasn't afraid of what that might mean. Whatever this was between them, he was ready to face it. Together. Stay tuned to see how Mark and Eleanor's growing connection changes the course of their business arrangement, and if the lines between partnership and something more begin to blur. The weeks that followed brought Mark and Eleanor closer in ways neither of them expected. The boundaries between business and personal had begun to blur, and it was becoming harder to distinguish where their arrangement ended and where their emotions began. At first, it had all been about appearances, attending events, smiling for the cameras, playing the role of the perfect couple. But now, those moments they shared, away from the public eye, were beginning to feel more genuine. There were quiet conversations over dinner, stolen glances in between meetings, and moments of unexpected laughter. It was all starting to feel real, and that scared Mark more than he was willing to admit. One evening, after a particularly long day, Mark found himself in Eleanor's office again. They had just finished a meeting with the board, and the tension in the room had been thick. Eleanor had remained composed, as always, but there was a faint edge to her voice when she had spoken. It was a reminder that even the most powerful people had their own battles to fight. Mark had noticed it more than once now. Eleanor wasn't just a businesswoman. She was someone who had built a life full of responsibility and sacrifice. And somewhere along the way, she had stopped letting people in. But somehow, he had managed to break through those walls, even if just a little. He knocked softly on her office door before entering, finding her sitting at her desk, flipping through paperwork. The usual tension was gone tonight, replaced by a quieter, more intimate atmosphere. She looked up as he entered, her expression unreadable, but there was a softness in her eyes that hadn't been there before. "You're here late," Eleanor remarked, her voice calm but not as distant as it usually was. "Is everything okay?" Mark nodded, walking over to the desk and sitting down across from her. "I just wanted to check in. You seemed a little off lately. Is everything going okay?" Eleanor gave him a faint smile, but it didn't quite reach her eyes. "It's nothing. Just the usual stress. Nothing I can't handle." Mark leaned forward slightly, his gaze never leaving hers. "You don't always have to do everything on your own, Eleanor. I'm here, remember?" Her eyes softened for a moment, and for the first time, she let her guard down just a little. "I know," she said quietly, her voice tinged with a vulnerability that Mark hadn't heard before. "It's just hard for me to let go of control. I've built everything on my own, and sometimes I wonder if I can really trust anyone to hold it all together." Mark reached across the desk, his hand resting lightly on hers. It was a simple gesture, but the weight of it wasn't lost on either of them. In that moment, he wasn't just the man who had agreed to a business arrangement. He was someone who truly cared about her. "You don't have to do it all alone anymore," he said softly, his voice filled with sincerity. "We're in this together, whether you like it or not." Eleanor's gaze flickered down to their hands, and for a moment, she said nothing. She was thinking, processing. Then, with a small sigh, she met his eyes again. "I've spent so much time building walls around myself. It's hard to let them down, even for you." Mark gave her a reassuring smile, his thumb gently brushing her hand. "You don't have to let them all down at once. Just let me in, even a little." There was a long pause as Eleanor considered his words. Finally, she nodded slowly, the vulnerability in her eyes deepening. "I'll try," she said quietly, "but I'm not sure how good I am at this. At trusting people." Mark smiled, his heart warming at the sincerity in her voice. "We'll take it one step at a time. I'm not going anywhere." For the first time, Eleanor smiled genuinely. It wasn't the confident, composed smile she showed to the world, but something softer, something real. In that moment, Mark realized that despite the contract that had initially brought them together, they were building something that wasn't just business anymore. It was a partnership, a connection, something that neither of them had anticipated when they first made their agreement. And for the first time, Mark felt a glimmer of hope for what could come next. Stay tuned to see how their relationship continues to evolve and whether they can truly build a future together beyond the business arrangement. The weeks following that night in Eleanor's office brought a shift in the air between Mark and Eleanor. What had started as a strictly business arrangement had slowly transformed into something neither of them could ignore. Their connection had grown deeper, their bond stronger, but neither of them was ready to put a label on it. Still, it was undeniable that something had changed between them, something that went beyond the facade of their marriage of convenience. The final test came when they were invited to a grand charity gala. It was the most important event of the year, a chance for Eleanor to showcase not just her business acumen, but her personal life as well. This was the moment they had been preparing for, Mark had been by her side at every event, but this time, the stakes were higher. It wasn't just about making a public appearance anymore. This time, it felt like the world was watching them, and for the first time, Eleanor wasn't just worried about her legacy, she was worried about them. As they arrived at the gala, the reporters were already gathered outside, cameras flashing as they walked up the steps of the grand venue. Mark could feel the weight of the moment as they stood together at the entrance. Eleanor was composed, as always, but Mark could see the slight tension in her posture. She had always been in control, but tonight, there was something different. She turned to him for a moment, her eyes meeting his, and he could see the uncertainty in her gaze. For the first time, he realized that maybe she wasn't as unshakable as she appeared. "You okay?" Mark asked quietly, his hand brushing against hers. She smiled, but it was a little too tight. "I'm fine," she replied, though Mark could tell she was lying. He squeezed her hand gently. "We've got this," he said, his voice steady. "You're not alone anymore, Eleanor." For the first time, she looked at him like she truly saw him, not as a business partner, but as someone she could trust. A flicker of something passed through her eyes, and in that moment, Mark realized just how far they had come. This wasn't just a contract anymore. They had built something real, something he had never expected. As the night wore on, they navigated the event with ease. Mark stood by her side, helping her with speeches, introducing her to influential guests, and playing his part perfectly. But as the night came to a close, Eleanor found herself standing on the balcony, looking out over the city. Mark joined her, and for a moment, they both just stood there in silence. Eleanor finally spoke, her voice softer than it had been all evening. "I never imagined this would be my life," she said quietly. "I thought I could do it all on my own. But you've changed that. You've made me realize that maybe I don't have to do everything alone." Mark turned to her, his heart racing at her words. "You don't," he said simply, reaching out to take her hand. "You never have to be alone again, Eleanor." For the first time, Eleanor allowed herself to lean into him, her head resting gently on his shoulder. The weight of the evening, the weight of everything they had been through, seemed to lift in that moment. They were no longer just business partners, no longer just a couple for appearances. They had become something more, a team, a partnership, and perhaps something even deeper. As they stood there, the sounds of the gala muffled in the background, Mark realized that this was the life he had always wanted. Not just success, but connection. With Eleanor, he had found something he hadn't even known he was looking for. The future was uncertain, and they still had challenges ahead, but for the first time, Mark didn't fear what lay ahead. They were in this together, and that was enough. No matter what happened next, they had built something real, and that, he knew, was worth everything. Stay tuned to see how Mark and Eleanor's journey continues, and whether they can navigate the complexities of their newfound relationship beyond the business arrangement.